The world right now feels like a lot. A lot of change, a lot of unknowns, a lot of, wait, is this the new normal or is something else about to shift again? And if you're someone who likes to plan, who likes to feel some sense of grounding before you take the next step, this season can feel especially destabilizing. But what if you had the skills to recognize signals through the noise? When you stop trying to figure out the future and start practicing how to move through many possible futures, something starts to shift. You stop bracing, you stop ruminating, and you start imagining ways forward. Welcome to the Building Thinkers podcast. I'm Tracy Clark, and my guest today spends his career in that exact terrain: the unknown, the ambiguous, the not yet. He's a futurist and the founder of Anticipate, a strategic foresight consultancy based in Copenhagen, working at the intersection of strategy, innovation, and social development. He's led some incredible strategic foresight projects with organizations like the United Nations, and as a futurist and head of partnerships at the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. And what I want us to all walk away with today is a sense of how this discipline, this practice, which can sound abstract or maybe academic from the outside, I think it's actually one of the most practical skill sets that we can develop right now for navigating the uncertainty of our work, our leadership, and our lives. So, without further ado, I'm so excited to be joined by.
Mathias Behn Bjørnhof, thank you so much for having me, Tracy.
I would love to start with this question of, what is it that you build and what brought you to the work that you're doing today?
Well, I would love that as an opening question. So I'm very much a builder by nature. I actually I studied entrepreneurship, and you might not believe it, but I can actually study the ways of thinkers and innovators and how they do things, right? So that's very much my approach to life in general. I say typically that my philosophy is design thinking and my approach is futures thinking. So combining the present with the futures in that way. And yeah, I've been building over the last 3 years my own little consultancy impact studio. We might call different things. Anticipate its name, to really trying to democratize futures thinking as a skill, as a ways of doing things that everyone can apply in their work and their personal lives, from big organizations, Fortune 500 and the UN, to even small organizations. So one person consultancies like my own. I try to take some of my own medicine from time to time as well.
Assuming that many don't know what we're talking about with futures thinking, can you start with a bit of how you approach this work and what it is?
Yeah, for sure. The discipline really is about setting the introduction, thinking in different potential futures, because the future is not predetermined, it's not set in stone yet. It's about having agency because of that, because of understanding the changes around us in society and the changes we want to carry out. And it's also about imagination and creativity and all these playful things that we don't use enough in our lives, professionally and not as adults, personally as well. Many people tend to forget that there are so many ways to see things, and so many things we can learn from as well. People out there doing great work, from signals of change in a different country, different cultural context. So people actually in your own organization that might sit in some knowledge that don't share enough. So my role is really like to bring out that through facilitation, to have these discussions that are so important strategically, and to really move innovation forward in many ways. That's what I think futures thinking in essence is about, really having discussions about what we think might happen and what we want to do about it.
One thing I'm noticing is, depending on who the LinkedIn algorithm and who you might be following and what might be coming on social media, there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of fear-based content, I think, right now. And there's a lot of lived reality right now of people who are losing their jobs. Things are shifting under their feet. So I'm not going to propose that it's all this like imagination of noise, but there is some sense of a lot of input that feels uncertain. And so maybe we can start there and think about, in the work context, If someone is seeing all of the dynamically changing things around them, where might you encourage individuals in the workplace to start thinking with a futures lens?
So I think fundamentally that's one aspect of our lives where we can take a little bit of a hint from futures, right? There are so many different narratives going on at the same time, but trying to distill and really looking at the longer term curves of things and not being caught up in the breaking news and those yellow beams everywhere from mainstream media and so on. There are many ways of finding information. I'm not proposing that there are, just look only for alternatives. I think a good balance and a good balanced diet and a good balanced news diet is really important. This part of things. To really look for things that also disagree with you, like actually fight the algorithm. I know that's much easier said than done, but we do get exposed to the things that we tend to like, and the same goes for artificial intelligence. It shows us things that it expects you to want to continue using it, right? That's how a lot of our internet structures is built, really like getting you to spend time on it. And yeah, I think it's also like sitting down, actually spending some more time on what Daniel Kahneman, I think it was called like kind of setting 1 and 2. We spend a lot of time like living through our biases and our automatic responses to things. That's most of our, our time actually spent on this. And we have these biases for a reason, I think built on experience and biological factors. But there is also sometimes a necessary space needed to carve out in terms of to move into setting 2. So what actually taking a bit longer to stop and think and say, being critical and say, okay, what is it actually I need to do? What do I want to do? And not like just being caught up in this accelerated tempo that it seems like we're all fighting against. There's so much out there and so much uncertainty, and the uncertainty can feel overwhelming. But I think it's because you also don't stop to take a moment to actually sit through and say, what's inside my control? What do I want to relate to? What do I want to focus on? And really spend that time. That's actually what AI is supposed to help us with, right? So it's supposed to help us free time for those bigger the tasks that we need to think more hardly about. So I think that's really taking the time to think. I think the carving out that time is so important these days, and not delegating, outsourcing the thinking to artificial intelligence in every living moment.
Oh, that's so powerful. Okay, I have a couple threads within that. I have a very specific one first. You talked about fighting the algorithm. Can you tell us about how do you do that personally? Can you give us an example of how our listeners can try to fight the algorithm to get maybe some more divergent thinking, things outside of what the algorithm thinks they want, things that might be keeping them in a pattern of maybe fear, uncertainty, whatever that is?
It's interesting to be provoked or be scared. That's also part of being human, and also sit with this discomfort sometimes that we
Mm,
tend to get the things the way we want it, and it's very convenient. We can just scroll through TikTok for ages or Facebook or whatever your platform is. But also sometimes, if there's something you don't necessarily agree with, a statement or a person, they try to understand where that feeling comes from. I think instead of just like saying, "Oh, yeah, I completely disagree. That doesn't make any sense for me," trying to empathize with the with the statements or the messages that some people who don't share the same perspectives have. Right? I think this the scariest thing about us, this data about democracies, and that's on a bigger level, is when we don't even stop to listen to people who disagree and try to hear where the things they're saying come from. It's not necessarily the messages are not necessarily packaged very well, but sometimes the underlying messages can be quite deep and come from a place of sincerity and maybe fear or discomfort about the state of things. So I think really empathy for me is the most critical human skill to have, and it's something that we're at risk of letting slip away a little bit because we tend to seek out people we don't need to empathize with because we understand them right away. That's a lot what futures thinking is really seeking to be provoked and moved in your ways of thinking, so you're not stuck in our old assumptions that might not work anymore for us, right? So that we actually listen to people who have a different view on things. That's a healthy thing. That's how we also got democracy in the first place, believe it or not. Yeah.
Yeah, it strikes me as, the power of proximity in being near people who think
Mm.
differently. And if you can't physically get in proximity to them, perhaps another space is within the algorithm to intentionally seek it out. And then I hear two things I want to pull apart there. When I was talking about the fear based, like I think there is some sort of boundary of protection for things that really don't serve you, like that could harm your mind. That's different than the intentional sitting in discomfort of thinking that might push your own. And
Mm.
so, yeah, I'll leave it at that, but it's nuanced, this seeking out things that might unlock different ways of thinking, new perspectives, and then also recognizing this idea that you shared of a balanced news diet.
Yeah, there's a difference between only sitting in discomfort and fear and sitting in it a little bit more than you might feel comfortable with, but intentionally seeking it out because it might move ways of thinking. So really well put.
You shared something on LinkedIn. I can't remember now at what point because you do a wonderful job of sharing lots of wonderful content on LinkedIn, but it might have been 2 weeks ago or so. And the theme that resonated with me, it reminded me of representation, right? The idea that if you don't see yourself represented in a job, like, how might you go forward into that? Similar in futures thinking of if all of our potential ideas about the future are these terrible dystopian AI is going to take us all over and we're all going to be beholden to the AI bots, which is a potential future. But if that's the only one that we're hearing, then we kind of miss the agency and creative opportunity to imagine a future of flourishing, imagine a future of both and of humans and technology in service of human flourishing. And so I want to hear more about that. I'm not sure if you recall which LinkedIn post around this, but how can we imagine hopeful futures?
Yeah, I think we sometimes need to actively look for that, right? Because it seems like there's so much of our society is built up around exactly what you say, fear or dystopias, and that has some strange fascination in us humans in some way that that keeps us, glued to the screen. Oh, doom and gloom. That it typically is also because we think of the end of the world as something that's of course, negative on a bigger scheme of things, but we tend to think of ourselves as someone thriving in that in some way or form. And I don't know what this basic human survival instinct comes in, but anyways, that's why I think we tend to seek towards those very kind of pessimistic futures. But when we talk about hope, I think there's so much to be hopeful for. But the thing is that the progress really shows up in the breaking news column. It's typically something that takes time and more of a established momentum and effort. It's something that sometimes we even need to seek it out. When I talk about the balanced news diet, for example, we have something called the world's best news here in Denmark. That you actually I can seek out because they're trying to really be a counter, an opposite to what's typically is taking place in that arena, right? Not to say that every piece of news should be super positive, but there is so much going on that's amazing. That's progress. If we also look at history, in the last 200 years, there's the industrialization and everything we have built. We in so many ways we're better off. Of course, there are things we have done damaged in the meantime, right? There are things that don't go as well, but 200 years ago, people lived until they were 40 on average. There was diseases that could kill you. I think sometimes we need to also understand how great human ingenuity is and how much progress we've been through and see that for the future ourselves. There was a recent study that showed that 70% of Americans would rather live in the past at some point than in the present or in the future. And I think, I understand that the nostalgia for how things were because there's some safety and certainty in that because it has happened. So in that way, it doesn't really provoke our fear mindset because we can kind of relate to it as stable. History is stable in that way, whereas the present is a bit uncertain and the future even more so. So we tend to don't even want to engage with that, right? Because change can also mean something can be worse. But in many ways, it also improves for the better typically. So I think we need to forcefully bring back some more hope and talk about the things we want and what divisions we long for instead of just talking about what we want to move away from. The anti-politics of the last decade of things we don't want in our societies needs to be replaced over time with something we actually want to achieve as well collectively. So I think that's also a change of mindset that is difficult to make on a collective level, but it starts starts with the individual meeting other individuals, and then building and like the mobilization for positive futures, and not being caught up in those mainstream ideas of, oh yeah, AI is going to take over everything and then destroy our lives. Or Elon Musk, who wants to live on Mars. Well, he can live on Mars if he wants to, but what about the rest of us? What do we actually want for our futures?
That's so powerful, and I wonder if one of the places that people can think as another starting point or maybe a lens through which to look could be what you just said, which is, what is it that we want? What is it that we want for the future? Is that a place that you think is a helpful question to start with? And how maybe you can take us through an organizational example of how strategic foresight helps activate things in an organization.
Yeah, for sure. I think we can start with what we want, but oftentimes, what a typical organization needs is to really like look outside and so what is actually happening. We also need to look at what's possible, which is beyond that, right? There are many things that are possible if we look 10, 15 years down the line, but still we need to kind of narrow in somewhere. So typically an organization would start a process like this. When I work with someone, like an insurance company, for example, we start by saying, okay, what are the signals of change around us in society? It doesn't mean that everything will change at some point, but there are indications already in society. It could be within our own industry, it could be some of the mega trends we're seeing, or what are the things that indicates a certain kind of change. So, it can be, for example, a process I did many years ago was for a Danish company, and we looked to California and how all of a sudden some insurers would stop insuring houses in areas where there was risk of forest fires, right? Back then, it's still, forest fires were somewhat regular, but not to the extent it is today. But we took this example and showed it to our client and said, okay, what would that mean in a Danish context, right? That is probably more flooding because we're a country with a lot of water around us. What would that mean? Can you already now start preparing for that in a Danish context? Because we know climate change will impact the country, like no matter what, right? So looking for those examples, also those bigger trends we're seeing. Okay, we were seeing individualization really becoming a big trend. People, glued to their phones, or the algorithms were kind of moving in different directions. So what would that mean for an insurance company that's fundamentally based on trust? So really holding on to some of those concepts and those examples out there that we can already see something changing. And then typically what we would then take those examples and do would be to say, okay, there are these bigger developments we're seeing. So could be artificial intelligence. What could be two extreme but plausible variations of that theme in the future, right? What could AI look like if we try to stretch thinking a little bit? In two different directions. It could be that AI, okay, will be, supporting every step of our lives, will be completely seamlessly integrated in how we move around and how we act and how we use devices and so on. Another one could be that it will stay as a tool, and it will kind of stay in that zone, and the development will be more conservative. That also depends on where we are in the world and all that, but those two plausible extremes are out there, right? So probably the future will be somewhere in between, but we need to discuss what are the key themes we need to focus on, and what are the kind of the focus in terms of the extreme outcomes. And then the next step would then be typically to build that into some sets of scenarios. So these future images of how the futures could be, that should be really like both, memorable and interesting, and that will be something we can look back on and say, okay, how did our strategy, our mindset actually shift when we think of these scenarios? How are we prepared for each of them? And that's also what happened with this client, for example, is that the core of our scenarios were, what will be the reason for being an insurance company in the future? Very fundamental existential question. Will it be to protect people, when they're hurt? Or should it be more like a preventative scenario, or like area where we try to actually improve people's lives before something bad happens to them? So those were kind of like one axis, and then the other axis were about who will be the market leaders. Will it be, for example, big tech companies? Will it be these big monoliths that will control it? Or will it be a lot of agile networks and players that will be a bit smaller in this sphere, but that can tap into each other's expertise? So the insurance company working together with tech and so on and so forth. So and you can see that the insurance company then over time they steered in a direction of they bet on a bigger market players in essence, but more on the established insurance players. And then they also bet that, okay, we might see a combination of insurance both being to protect people, but also to improve their lives because we need both at the same time, right? So as the strategy we built kind of moved them into that direction. So they were sold off to a bigger company. And then you can see also from the campaigns they did and the focus in services that they kind of moved in a little bit of a more innovative direction than they were originally.
What is the role of imagination in futures thinking?
It's something we tend to forget over time, okay, or not take as seriously. You're dreaming, or there are these things that you might want to have, or daydreaming, right? It's kind of being boxed in the category of being not serious, but for ways of thinking about the futures differently, or building new things, or doing innovation, we can't not use our imagination because that's the most powerful resource we have almost in life, right? So that's also where the kind of the want comes in. So what kind of futures do we want? We need to be able to imagine them before we can go towards them. And of course, some things will happen a bit randomly, things we have to orient ourselves towards that are happening in society around us. But if we have a clear indication of what could be a cool world to live in, then it's also easier to move in that direction and make other people follow along with that idea. It could be a new product, it could be a new idea for a whole market you're establishing, right? But really like tapping into what is it actually we want to move towards. It's a bit difficult if you're just all over the map, kind of only responding all the time. Sometimes you need to also point and lead the way and be a trailblazer in your field.
I was doing some work for a client in the Fortune 150 space, and we were doing some scenario planning and using some strategic foresight methods. And what I noticed was the room of very, high level leaders. I think that somehow in the scenarios work, it provides a container for what I would call imagination, but not always explicitly say imagination because of that weird, boxing in of it as not serious, but somehow when it's like scenarios and there's an axis, then it's fine to dream because we're in an axis. We have an axis. But I do think, I have seen the work of innovation when you have some ridiculous scenario. I mean, the edges of it are maybe possible, but it does allow for this opening of the mind, dare I say playfulness, for people to kind of step into that space and consider possibilities. And maybe it's not that exact possibility that kind of lands, but it did give the room and the freedom to think in a different way about, in this case, like products that have existed for many years, but gave room for innovation because of that room to think. And I'm curious if you've experienced the same thing in this idea of scenarios and the space that that provides for people.
100%. And I think it's important that exactly that difference between this kind of the very I don't know, structured approach to it, where you end up in a 2 by 2 matrix
Yep.
and it's more for maybe strategy or risk management, trying to really be structured around changes you see and so on. And then the more free approaches where imagination really comes into play. I think there are great examples mainly in the futures design space, and someone like Julian Bleeker, for example, who have envisioned great things and great artifacts from the future that really moves us in a different way. I must say, when we compare the impact of scenario matrices, which I love as a method, and the impact of more free thinking, more open approaches to imagining futures, I think the more open ones have had much more of an impact. Science fiction is one example. Art is another one where really the fact that we have tried to come up with something that doesn't fit into the rigid frames of what we find plausible right now, that's really also where a lot of magic can happen. But in organizational context, it's like trying to find in between the kind of the rigid structured approaches and then being able to use your imagination. That's really that tough balance to strike, where it has to be usable in the present, right? So I think a
Yeah.
combination of both is really where there's a lot of magic happening. I do a lot of futures prototyping where we try to develop scenarios very quickly. So typically prompting them. So we draw cards or we try to come up with different frames, and then we build something from that very quickly, right? So that's when I put my innovation hat on and use futures thinking and we could deal with the innovation. That's typically what that space is, right? Where we the scenario are not based on on a full story or anything necessarily. It's based on a few keywords, a few different, like a situation you are in the future, and then we have to create an object or a service or something that fits into that future. And then we talk about, okay, what does it mean for today? Like, what can we actually do today that could make this come alive in a sense that makes sense, right? So it's really the combination of both is where the magic happens, I think.
I love that question. What is meaningful today? And this idea of it being usable in the present. And that's where it kind of comes back into some grounding and purpose, not only for the divergence of thinking, but then for what that inspires in the now. Matthias,
Yeah.
we have a sentence stem prompt that we like to share, and it's if only people knew. So, as we've been talking about futures thinking, strategic foresight, this agency, what would you say if only people knew about the future or this way of thinking?
If only people knew the field, I think they see the magic of it. It might be a bit of a meta answer, but being a futurist, a foresight practitioner, depending on how you see things, that I experience this daily, right? That people question what I do, and I love that because people need to be skeptical meeting someone who puts on a futurist hat and start talking about what the future could be, right? But there's so little awareness that this is even a field, so that's part of my mission is to spread the word of. I feel sometimes like a gospel or evangelizer that I'm really trying to bring this into people's minds and like, giving them the awareness that I wish I had many more years before I started
Mhm.
learning this as a discipline, because it does make sense for most people when they find out what it brings. Um, that is a combination of being analytical and being creative, right? So we're using both half of our brain. So if only people knew about the field, then my life would be easier. But also, I think we would look at a much different society where we could actually think more from the outside in. We could use our imagination more actively. It's also about critical thinking. It's about having like a multidisciplinarity in nature of the tools we use, the way we think about things. So that's really my big mission is to like get this out to as many people as possible, and also perhaps even further, train people to think in these ways. I prefer that. I prefer to be the facilitator of the conversations. I
Mhm.
prefer to train people in the frameworks and the tools and the mindsets, and then they can go and make their own better futures. So that's a lot of what I find passionate around.
Mm, I love that. Matthias, the idea of making their own futures better really resonates with me.
Mm.
It's a fundamental principle of why I started building thinkers as well. Like this idea of activating human potential, being integrated into human flourishing in organizations, in social impact projects. I think that really drives a lot of the projects I like to be a part of, and so that really resonates. And also, when you were talking about it being a both and of analytical and creative. I hope our listeners hear that, that it's like to embrace the creativity and joy and playful side and to know that there is rigorous analytical practice to this work and integrating qualitative and quantitative data to inform
Mm.
many of the practices that is a piece of this work. And I'm curious if you're thinking about the students of the future, what would you say they need to most learn? I heard you say democratizing futures thinking is a piece of this. What types of skills do you think that they need in this area?
And really, people can come from all different disciplines and learn and use these methods. It's really that's agnostic a discipline, which I love about it as well. People can be astrophysicists and be good at doing foresight, and they can be super creative designers, interior designers who have a completely different way of thinking. And getting those people to convene, I think is really the magic of the discipline as well. I would say in terms of skills for the future, I have thought about this myself because like I coming from a foresight consultancy, you kind of have to think about your own futures as well. What can I offer to the futures where artificial intelligence might be more present, right? And so I've been trying to focus on some of the more human skills that I have that I also love doing, right? So it's kind of the ikigai, if people know that, of finding your purpose and what you're good at, and really what's needed out there. I've been trying to see, okay, what do I actually where do I actually fit in? And I think something like facilitation skills. The facilitation is not just facilitating a room or in a workshop. It's negotiation. It's bringing people together and having good conversations around it, convening people in that way, and being able to synthesize as well. What is going on in a comprehensive manner. That's the kind of like pulling in the threads. So I think like systems thinkers, conveners, facilitators. Those are some skills I like to think of, and I think a lesson can also be learned now speaking from my own country is that our word for education is uddannelse, which means that you're becoming a whole person. So that's the kind of exercise when you're like educating yourself, is that you're becoming a whole person who contributes to society in that way. So I think there are many life skills that are not being necessarily being taught. We still rely a lot on memorizing things in school systems, and I think we need to, of course, know certain things and work up that experience, but we also need to be able to know where information comes from and being critical around it. It's not to say that we should just be critical about every single piece of information, but I think that, of course, is a skill as well for the future, and be able to rationalize why things are happening the way they are and maybe more analytical. So I think that's really where I see things going, becoming even stronger as some of the human skills. And of course, empathy. It's difficult maybe to train, but it comes from also seeking out people with different perspectives.
Oh, I love this. I'm stuck back on the word for education in Denmark being meaning becoming a whole person. No wonder you all are so good at education. I mean, that is literally the word and the focus. And if our education systems really pursued that as the vision of becoming a whole person, I think often about the exponential power in our students and whether, I'm using students broadly in this sense of learners, humans. If there is a rooting and a centering that our systems should support humans in becoming whole humans in whatever even different industry that's in. Last week, I was at the Executive Flourishing Forum in Denver, rooted in the Harvard Human Flourishing program work and the Global Flourishing Study. We had the opportunity to hear from Matt Lee, who is involved in the Harvard Flourishing program, and he talked about love. And he talked about love being to will the good of the other. And that has been sticking with me because in the context of work, we don't often use the word love or heart or, that again sounds, fluffy or something. But I've been thinking about how central that is to empathy, of course, and to coming together and to get unstuck from so many of the human problems of communication, of conflict, of even just misunderstanding that I see across different, organizations, across different interpersonal relationships. What if we just paused and said, got in proximity with other people who think differently than us, got in proximity with divergent ideas? How might that help us grow into more whole humans and respond in ways that instead of perpetuating discord or disunity brought us together. And I recognize I'm a person of optimism, and yet it seems also really rooted in, like, there's a ton of research around this of how that can change organizations. And so I love that. I'm really drawn to the Harvard Flourishing program work because they are putting decades of research behind principles that to me make so much sense but are often categorized in a similar way to what we were talking about earlier, where creativity and imagination is categorized as unserious. And love similarly seems like too big somehow, or too like keep that in your personal life, get that out of here at work. And I think more of the integration that you're describing in this becoming a whole person could be a way forward. That's a future I would like to live in that is,
Mhm.
that any place in my locus of control that I'm interacting with someone else, what if I paused and said, how can I will the good of that person? How can I will the good of that organization? And does that shift anything for me? So I don't know if any of that resonates with what you've seen too.
No, completely. I think it's a great way of putting it on. Yeah, it's not something easy, right? Love is also a bit of a chance to take in some ways because you're willing the good of the other, and then you're hoping for others to will the good of you in that way, right? Yeah, so I think it's a great approach to life. I love the future as a subject, but I love even more to understand what it means for us humans and how it can make us move together in certain directions. We can disagree, we can have different perspectives, but that's the magic of futures as well, is that it's unknowable. We can't for sure know what will happen, right? So we can discuss and argue and deliberate and agree and all this, but at the end of the day, we have to make it ourselves as well.
I want to kind of wind down our time, and I want to make sure that our listeners hear about your courses, different ways they could maybe work with you. So, will you share anything about your work and where they could sign up for joining some of your upcoming courses or offerings or anything like that?
I'm on LinkedIn a lot, as you can hear from Tracy, and sharing things because of that mission I talked about. Democratizing futures also means that I share a lot of information for free, and I want to get people started in this. If there's want to take it a step further, there's both the I have prepared a guide called the Futurists Guide to Foresight, which is on our website, anticipatefutures.com. There's also different masterclasses if you want to dive more into cultural foresight or how to do foresight. We have offerings on how to become a foresight facilitator, how to facilitate futures as a space, which is something else. And then we also offer for trainings and the methodology for groups of people who want to, up their futures thinking and get a little bit more familiar and even have discussion on an interesting topic like what are the mega trends and what do they mean for us in our organization and our community, right? So yeah, I love working in this field and I love to share it with other people as well. So there's a lot of stuff to read and listen to and watch and yeah, also feel free to reach out. My inbox is very much open.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I thought of one more question, and I want to ask you, Matthias, what is your hope for the future?
Yeah, I think the future will probably be a better place in many ways than it is right now, right? You can talk about my personal hope, and I hope to start a family, and that's one of the things. I think people are a bit worried about that at the moment. I think that there are so many great things about bringing kids up into this world, so I would love to
Mm.
do that in the hopefully near future. I hope for that we will like kind of after diverging a bit on a geopolitical spectrum of things, we'll find a way to converge because of what we have realized this is doing to us. So I'm very hopeful that maybe some of these points that we talk about the public crisis, like there's no tomorrow or the world is going to end, but I think it also brings a lot of realization that we don't want to get stuck in this way of doing things and seeing things. And so my hope is really to be able to move out of the crisis with a new sense of energy and a bit more of a better relationship with the planet and the other people here.
Matthias, thank you so much for sharing your vision for the future. I hope our listeners can sit in this positive discomfort, like sit in a moment of the not knowing and consider the power of this type of thinking and the agency that's possible. I hope that any of our listeners that want to learn more, we'll put all of the links to your work and your courses in the episode description. And then one of the other things that we do is 2 weeks after the episode comes out or the week after the episode, depending on all things in our worlds, we send out a blueprint for thought. And that is a thinking activity that allows our listeners, if they want to take the concept, apply it further. We love creating those. And so if you aren't signed up for our Building Thinkers newsletter, we'll put that link in the episode description. And thank you so much, Matthias, for joining us. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.